In the dead of night, late September 1983, a fleet of heavily loaded cement trucks rolled into a landfill in the dusty, isolated desert town of Alamogordo, New Mexico. Under the strict cover of darkness and guarded by local police to keep out prying eyes, workers began dumping thousands of crushed cardboard boxes into a massive, freshly dug trench. Then they poured thick, wet concrete over the pile, sealing it deep within the earth. Their cargo wasn't toxic waste, illegal weapons, or a classified government secret. It was millions of copies of a children's video game. A game so catastrophically bad, so universally despised, that it didn't just destroy the multi-billion-dollar company that made it, it almost annihilated the entire video game industry overnight. How do you go from dominating the global entertainment market to burying your greatest shame under a slab of concrete in the desert? To understand the sheer magnitude of this disaster, you have to realize that this wasn't just a simple mistake in coding. It was a fatal disease of corporate arrogance, a culture of profound disrespect, an impossible deadline, and a dark secret that executives desperately tried to erase from the history books. Before we unearth the dark truth behind the great video game crash of 1983, if you're fascinated by the hidden stories, corporate wars, and epic failures of the tech and gaming world, hit that subscribe button right now. We dig up the past so you don't have to. Act 1. The Silicon Valley Titan and the Culture Clash. To truly grasp how far Atari fell, we first have to look at how high they climbed. Rewind to the late 1970s and early 80s. Atari wasn't just a tech company. It was a global cultural phenomenon. Founded by Nolan Bushnell, Atari was the birthplace of the modern video game industry. With the release of the Atari 2600 console, they didn't just enter millions of American living rooms, they owned them. Kids weren't just playing games, they were completely obsessed. Atari was printing money, pulling in over $2 billion a year at its peak, making it the fastest-growing corporation in the history of the United States. But behind the flashing pixels and massive profits, a civil war was brewing. In 1976, Warner Communications bought Atari. They replaced the laid-back, engineer-focused Bushnell with a man named Ray Kassar. Kassar was a former textile executive from Burlington Industries. He wore tailored suits, drove a chauffeured limousine, and fundamentally did not understand or respect the video game business. To him, video games were not art, and they certainly weren't software engineering marvels. When they were generic commodities, he famously referred to Atari's brilliant programmers as nothing more than towel designers. Under Kassar's leadership, the company culture became notoriously toxic. The programmers, the actual geniuses writing the complex assembly code that made Atari its billions, were treated as highly expendable factory workers. They were kept in the dark. They received absolutely no royalties for the games they created, no public credit or names on the game boxes, and only a tiny, insulting fraction of the immense wealth their creations generated. This blatant corporate disrespect led to a massive brain drain. The absolute best developers at Atari had enough. They left the company and formed a rival studio, the very first third-party game developer in history, a company you might know today as Activision. But Atari management didn't care. They believed their brand name was invincible. And they thought consumers were so hopelessly addicted to the Atari 2600 that they would blindly buy literally anything with the Atari logo slapped onto it. And that lethal dose of corporate overconfidence set the stage for the biggest unforced error in entertainment history: the warning signs and the $21 million handshake. The cracks in Atari's armor actually began to show just before the ET disaster. Atari had secured the rights to port the arcade smash hit Pac-Man to the 2600. But instead of giving the developer the time and cartridge space needed to make a good game, they rushed it out. The Atari 2600 version of Pac-Man was a flickering, hideous mess that barely resembled the arcade original. Yet it still sold millions, based purely on brand recognition. And this gave Atari executives the ultimate false positive. Quality doesn't matter, only the brand matters. Then came the summer of 1982. Steven Spielberg's cinematic masterpiece, E.T. the Extraterrestrial, hit theaters and instantly became a global cultural earthquake. It broke every box office record imaginable, capturing the hearts of millions. Naturally, Steve Ross, the CEO of Atari's parent company Warner Communications, wanted a piece of that massive, lucrative pie. Then Ross personally bypassed the entire Atari management team, ignoring anyone with actual video game experience, and negotiated directly with Spielberg. He bought the exclusive rights to make an E.T. video game for an unprecedented, mind-boggling sum, $21 million. To put that massive figure into perspective, most video game development budgets at the time were a few $1,000s. But there was a massive, ticking time bomb attached to this historic deal. So the negotiations had dragged on for months, and the contract was finally signed in late July. In order to manufacture the physical cartridges, print the instruction manuals, box them all up, and ship them to retail stores across the country in time for the crucial Christmas shopping season, the game had to be completely finished by September 1st. Normally, a game for the incredibly complex Atari 2600 took 5 to 6 months to design, program, test, and debug. Atari had just promised Steven Spielberg they would do it in exactly 5 weeks. To pull off this absolute miracle, Atari turned to Howard Scott Warshaw. Warshaw was their golden boy. He was a brilliant, eccentric programmer who had just successfully adapted Spielberg's Raiders of the Lost Ark into a massive, critically acclaimed hit for the console. When CEO Ray Kassar called him directly and asked if he could make an E.T. game in 5 weeks, Warshaw, fueled by youthful hubris, supreme confidence in his own abilities, and the thrill of the ultimate coding challenge, he said yes. What followed was a terrifying descent into coding madness. Warshaw moved a complete development system into his home so he wouldn't waste time commuting. For 5 agonizing weeks he worked 36-hour shifts. He barely slept, surviving on takeout food, caffeine, and pure adrenaline, staring at glowing lines of assembly code until his eyes physically bled. He was attempting to do the impossible, condense a deeply emotional, cinematic, narrative-driven experience into a primitive machine that possessed less computing power than a modern musical greeting card. Warshaw envisioned a relatively complex game. E.T. had to explore various screens, collect hidden telephone pieces to phone home, and manage his energy levels while constantly avoiding a relentless FBI agent and an obsessive scientist who would capture him and steal his items. But complex ideas require time for playtesting, time for balancing difficulty, time for debugging, and time for refinement, time that Warshaw simply did not have. There was zero quality assurance, there were no focus groups. The absolute moment the code was somewhat stable and could run from start to finish without completely crashing the system, it was ripped from his exhausted hands, burned onto memory chips and rushed straight to the manufacturing plants. Atari management was so dangerously, blindingly confident in the E.T. brand that they manufactured 5 million physical copies of the game. Keep in mind there were only about 10 to 12 million Atari 2600 consoles in existence at the time. They essentially bet the entire company that roughly half of their entire global user base would buy the game based on the movie's title alone. December 1982 arrived. The shiny gold-foiled boxes of E.T. hit the shelves everywhere from Sears to local toy shops. Parents, desperate to give their kids a piece of the magic they experienced in the movie theater, bought the game in droves. Initially, it looked like a success, moving about 1.5 million units right out of the gate. But then Christmas morning came, and the kids actually plugged the cartridges into their consoles. What they experienced wasn't the heartwarming magic of Spielberg. It was an exercise in pure, unfiltered, agonizing frustration. The game was an incomprehensible, disjointed mess. E.T. looked like a pixelated green blob. The objective was deeply confusing, and the manual was no help. But the absolute worst part, the specific feature that broke the spirit of millions of children and cemented the game's infamous legacy, was the pits. The map was covered in massive, inexplicably placed green holes in the ground. Players would take one step and instantly fall into a pit. To get out, you had to press the button to make E.T. slowly stretch his neck and levitate upward, but the hit detection was so utterly broken that the exact millisecond E.T.'s feet touched the top edge of the screen to transition out of the pit, he would instantly fall right back down into it, over and over and over again. It was a torturous, inescapable loop of awful, untested game design. Word of mouth, even before the internet, I spread like a raging wildfire on school playgrounds across America. The message was clear: do not buy E.T. Retailers were suddenly hit with a massive tsunami of returns. Angry parents demanded their money back. Millions of unsold copies sat rotting on store shelves and piling up in distributor warehouses. But the E.T. disaster wasn't just an isolated product failure, it was the final, devastating match that ignited a massive powder keg. For years, the market had been slowly flooded with terrible, low-quality games from shady third-party developers trying to cash in on the craze. There was a game about brushing your teeth, a game sponsored by Purina Dog Chow. E.T. was simply the breaking point. It completely shattered the illusion of the video game magic. It destroyed consumer trust forever. In 1983, the video game market didn't just decline, it violently, spectacularly collapsed. Industry revenues plummeted from a towering $3.2 billion in 1982 to a mere $100 million by 1985. That is a devastating 97% drop. Arcades closed their doors by the thousands. Long-standing companies filed for bankruptcy. Retailers heavily discounted games, throwing them into $5 bargain bins just to get them out of their sight, and many major department stores vowed never to stock video games again, viewing them as a dead, worthless fad. And that brings us back to the cold desert night. Atari was hemorrhaging money at a terrifying rate. They were paying massive warehouse storage fees just to house millions of useless, returned E.T. cartridges, along with unsold consoles and other failed games. In a desperate, humiliating move to physically clear inventory, hide their colossal failure, and write off the massive losses for tax purposes, they made a decision that would become an urban legend for 3 decades. Under the cover of night, 14 massive truckloads of Atari merchandise were hauled to the Alamogordo landfill. To prevent local kids from scavenging the dump and reselling the games, the crushed plastic and cardboard were entombed under a thick, permanent layer of concrete. Atari never officially admitted what exactly was buried there. They tried to sweep it under the rug. For 30 years, the E.T. burial was treated like the Roswell UFO crash of the gaming world, a myth, and a wild rumor whispered on internet forums and early gaming magazines. That was until 2014. An excavation team, backed by a major documentary film crew, and after months of legal battles with the city, finally secured permission to dig up the Alamogordo landfill. As heavy excavators dug deep into the New Mexico dirt, breaking through that 30-year-old layer of concrete, the crowd held its breath. Then an excavator claw emerged from the dust, carrying pieces of crushed black plastic, or twisted metal, and a remarkably well-preserved, slightly faded piece of cardboard. There it was, the face of the friendly alien, the golden Atari logo. The myth was entirely 100% true. They eventually unearthed over 1,000 cartridges that day, physical artifacts of the industry's greatest hubris. The aftermath: Howard Scott Warshaw, the man who spent 35 years carrying the heavy, unfair burden of creating the worst game of all time, was actually there at the excavation. Seeing the games pulled from the dirt wasn't a traumatic experience for him, it was a profound sense of closure. He realized, and the world finally understood, that E.T. didn't kill the video game industry. It was merely the most visible scapegoat for the toxic, greedy, and short-sighted business practices of corporate executives who failed to respect the art of game development and underestimated the intelligence of their players. Like Atari's legendary hubris taught the industry a lesson it would never, ever forget. When a Japanese company named Nintendo eventually decided to brave the dead American market and resurrect the console industry a few years later with the NES, they introduced something revolutionary: the seal of quality. This was a direct, calculated response to the Atari disaster, a strict guarantee to consumers that games had to be rigorously tested, reviewed, unofficially approved, before they could ever be released. E.T. for the Atari 2600 stands today as a concrete monument to corporate failure. A permanent reminder buried in the desert sands that no brand is too big to fail, no empire is invincible, and that you can never, ever take your audience for granted. If you had 5 weeks, a blank screen, and the weight of a multi-billion-dollar company on your shoulders, do you honestly think you could have coded a better game? Or was Atari doomed the exact moment they signed that $21 million check? Let me know your deepest theories down in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey into gaming's darkest hour, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell for more historical deep dives. See you in the next one.